There's a specific delayed consequence that almost nobody warns people about when they hurt an empath, one that doesn't announce itself immediately, doesn't produce an obvious explosion in the moment of the harm itself, but instead unfolds slowly, quietly, permanently, in a way that most people who cause this kind of pain never see coming and rarely fully understand, even after they've experienced its effects firsthand. Today I want to talk honestly about what actually happens when someone genuinely hurts an empath, why this specific kind of harm produces consequences so different from hurting someone without this particular psychological makeup, and why understanding this reality matters both for empaths trying to make sense of their own experience and for anyone who might be underestimating exactly what they're risking when they treat this kind of person carelessly. To understand why hurting an empath produces such a specific, often terrifying set of consequences, you first have to understand something fundamental about how empaths actually process relational harm differently from people without this heightened sensitivity. Most people experience hurt as a relatively contained, if painful, event. Something happens, they feel bad about it, they process the feeling over some reasonable period of time, and eventually the intensity fades, allowing them to move forward with reasonable emotional distance from the original incident. Empaths process harm through an entirely different mechanism, one that involves absorbing not just the surface-level event itself, but the full emotional context surrounding it, the intention behind the action, the pattern it might represent, the specific meaning it carries about how they're actually valued by the person who caused it. This deeper processing means that hurting an empath rarely produces a simple, containable wound. It produces something that integrates itself into their broader understanding of trust, safety, and their own worth in ways that extend far beyond the specific incident that caused the initial pain. The first specific consequence of hurting an empath involves what I'd call permanent pattern recognition, a shift that occurs almost immediately and, crucially, cannot be undone, regardless of how thoroughly you might eventually apologize or attempt to repair the relationship afterward. Empaths, precisely because of their heightened perceptive capacity, don't simply register that a specific hurtful incident occurred. They immediately, often unconsciously, integrate that incident into a broader pattern recognition system, cross-referencing it against every previous interaction, every subtle inconsistency they may have previously excused or explained away, every moment that suddenly makes more sense now that this specific harm has revealed something significant about your actual character or intentions. This means that a single instance of genuine harm often doesn't stay contained as a single instance in an empath's understanding of you. It retroactively illuminates a pattern they may have been unconsciously tracking all along, and once this illumination occurs, it genuinely cannot be reversed, regardless of subsequent good behavior or genuine remorse. The second specific consequence involves the particular way empaths process betrayal specifically, which differs significantly from how they might process other forms of interpersonal disappointment or conflict. Because empaths invest so deeply, so genuinely, in understanding and caring for the people close to them, betrayal by someone they've extended this depth of understanding toward doesn't register simply as disappointment. It registers as a kind of fundamental miscalibration in their entire system for reading and trusting people, producing a specific, often terrifying kind of self-doubt that extends far beyond the specific relationship in question. If someone this perceptive, this attuned, this genuinely careful about understanding people accurately, still ended up genuinely hurt by someone they trusted deeply, the natural question that arises is whether their entire perceptive capacity, the very thing that makes them who they are, can actually be trusted at all going forward, a question that produces genuine, sometimes prolonged, psychological disruption, extending well beyond the specific relationship that originally caused this doubt to surface. The third specific consequence, and this one deserves particular attention because it's rarely discussed openly, involves the specific physiological toll that betrayal by someone genuinely trusted takes on an empath's nervous system, a toll that often manifests through physical symptoms that seem, on the surface, disconnected from the emotional harm that actually caused them. Sleep disruption that persists long after the specific incident has passed. Digestive issues that flare up specifically during periods of heightened relational stress. A general persistent sense of physical unease that doctors sometimes struggle to explain through purely physical examination alone. This isn't coincidental or exaggerated. Empaths process emotional information partly through their physical nervous system in ways that produce genuine, measurable physiological effects, meaning the harm caused by betraying an empath's trust doesn't remain contained to the emotional or psychological realm alone. It frequently manifests as genuine, sometimes significant physical symptoms that persist well beyond what might be expected from a purely emotional disappointment. The fourth specific consequence involves what happens to an empath's capacity for future connection, both with the specific person who caused the harm and, more broadly, with new people entering their life afterward. This consequence often surprises people who assume that hurting an empath simply damages one specific relationship, without fully understanding how significantly this experience can ripple outward into every subsequent connection the empath attempts to build. Because empaths extend such genuine deep trust when they do decide to invest in someone, being betrayed by that trust doesn't just damage the specific relationship in question. It frequently produces a significant recalibration of how much trust they're willing to extend going forward, sometimes producing years of more guarded, more careful engagement with new people. A genuine cost extracted not just from the original relationship, but from every future connection that might have otherwise benefited from the same depth of openness this specific betrayal taught them to protect more carefully. The fifth specific consequence, and this deserves genuine, careful attention because it represents one of the most misunderstood aspects of this entire dynamic, involves the specific timeline on which empaths actually process and eventually respond to significant hurt. A timeline that frequently confuses and destabilizes the person who caused the original harm precisely because it doesn't match the more immediate, more visible reaction they might have expected. Because empaths process harm through the deeper, more complex mechanism we discussed earlier, their full emotional and behavioral response often doesn't emerge immediately following the original incident. Instead, it develops gradually, sometimes over weeks or months, as the full pattern recognition process we discussed continues integrating new information and reaching increasingly clear, increasingly stable conclusions about what actually happened and what it actually means. This delayed timeline means that someone who hurt an empath might genuinely believe, in the immediate aftermath, that the relationship survived relatively unscathed, only to discover, sometimes months later, that a complete, permanent shift has occurred, one that feels sudden and unexpected to them, despite having actually been developing steadily, invisibly, throughout the entire intervening period. The sixth specific consequence involves what happens specifically to the person who caused the original harm, a consequence that connects directly to conversations we've had previously about the internal disturbance that persists, even when it doesn't translate into visible accountability. Hurting an empath, specifically, precisely because of the depth and genuineness of the connection they typically offer before any harm occurs, tends to produce a uniquely persistent form of this internal disturbance in the person responsible for causing it. This isn't necessarily conscious guilt in any straightforward sense, but rather a kind of ongoing, difficult-to-shake awareness that something significant was lost, an awareness that surfaces in unguarded moments, in comparisons to subsequent relationships that never quite replicate the same depth of understanding and attunement, in a persistent, quiet sense that something valuable was squandered through careless or intentional harm that can never actually be fully recovered or replaced. This isn't necessarily conscious guilt in any straightforward sense, but rather a kind of ongoing, difficult-to-shake awareness that something significant was lost, an awareness that surfaces in unguarded moments, in comparisons to subsequent relationships that never quite replicate the same depth of understanding and attunement, in a persistent, quiet sense that something valuable was squandered through careless or intentional harm that can never actually be fully recovered or replaced. And this is exactly where I want to take the rest of our conversation, because understanding these 6 consequences is only useful if it also equips both empaths and the people who love them with genuine, practical guidance for navigating this specific terrain, whether you're the one who was hurt, trying to make sense of what you're experiencing, or someone hoping to genuinely understand what you might be risking before you treat this kind of person carelessly. The first thing worth understanding, specifically for empaths processing this kind of harm, is why the permanent pattern recognition we discussed doesn't need to be feared or resisted, even though it initially feels overwhelming and, in some sense, unwanted. This pattern recognition, however uncomfortable, actually represents your nervous system doing exactly what it's designed to do, protecting you by accurately integrating new, significant information about someone's actual character and intentions. The discomfort of seeing a pattern you'd previously excused or explained away isn't a malfunction. It's your perceptive capacity finally operating without the interference of hope, wishful thinking, or generous interpretation that may have previously kept this pattern from becoming fully visible to your conscious awareness. Learning to trust this recognition, rather than fighting against it or trying to talk yourself back into your previous, more generous interpretation, is genuinely one of the most important skills for processing this kind of harm in a way that actually protects you going forward. The second thing worth understanding is how to address the specific self-doubt we discussed regarding your own perceptive capacity. The terrifying question of whether your entire system for reading and trusting people can actually be relied upon after being genuinely hurt by someone you'd trusted deeply. I want to offer a specific reframe here that genuinely matters. Being deceived by someone skilled at concealment doesn't actually indicate a flaw in your perceptive capacity. It indicates that the person who hurt you was specifically, sometimes exceptionally, skilled at presenting a version of themselves calibrated precisely to bypass whatever discernment you would have otherwise applied. Your perceptive capacity isn't broken simply because someone specifically talented at deception successfully deceived you. This distinction matters enormously because concluding that your entire perceptive system requires fundamental repair, rather than simply acknowledging that you encountered someone unusually skilled at concealment, sets you up for a much longer, much more difficult recovery than the situation actually requires. The third thing to understand, specifically regarding the physiological toll we discussed, is that addressing this kind of harm effectively often requires attention to your actual physical body, not simply your emotional or psychological processing alone. If you're experiencing persistent sleep disruption, digestive issues, or general physical unease following significant relational betrayal, these symptoms deserve genuine, direct attention rather than being dismissed as secondary to the real emotional work you're doing. This might mean working with practitioners who understand the genuine mind-body connection involved in processing significant emotional harm, incorporating deliberate practices specifically designed to help regulate your nervous system, or simply giving yourself explicit permission to address physical symptoms as a legitimate part of your healing process, rather than treating them as an inconvenient distraction from the emotional work you believe should be your primary focus. The fourth thing worth exploring is how to protect your capacity for future connection, specifically preventing the recalibration we discussed from calcifying into a permanent, excessive guardedness that ultimately costs you far more than the specific relationship that originally caused this harm. This requires a deliberate, ongoing practice of distinguishing between the specific person who hurt you and the entirely new people you'll encounter going forward, resisting the natural but ultimately costly tendency to apply lessons learned from one specific betrayal indiscriminately to every subsequent relationship, regardless of that new person's actual, individually demonstrated character. This distinction requires genuine, deliberate effort because your nervous system, understandably, wants to generalize protective lessons broadly in order to prevent similar harm from recurring. But this generalization, left unchecked, ultimately isolates you from exactly the kind of genuine connection you remain fully capable of building with people who've actually earned, through their own individual demonstrated behavior, the trust that this specific previous betrayal taught you to extend more carefully. The fifth thing to understand, particularly for anyone confused by the delayed timeline we discussed, whether you're the empath experiencing this delayed processing yourself or someone trying to understand a relationship's apparently sudden shift, is that this delay doesn't represent inauthentic or manipulative behavior on the empath's part. It represents genuine, ongoing processing that requires time specifically because of the depth and complexity involved in fully understanding what actually happened. If you're an empath experiencing this delayed timeline, give yourself explicit permission to trust your own pace, rather than feeling pressure to reach a faster, more immediately visible conclusion simply because that's what the person who hurt you or people around you might expect based on more typical, faster processing timelines. And if you're someone who's hurt an empath and confused by what feels like a sudden, unexpected shift months after the original incident, understanding this timeline should help you recognize that this shift was never actually sudden at all. It was the natural, inevitable culmination of a process that had been developing steadily, invisibly throughout the entire intervening period. The sixth thing worth addressing, specifically for anyone who might be reading this as a kind of warning before they consider treating an empath carelessly, deserves direct, honest attention rather than being softened into something more comfortable to hear. If you're someone who has genuinely, consistently benefited from an empath's depth of understanding, patience, and care, and you're now considering whether their trust and investment can simply be taken for granted, treated carelessly without significant lasting consequence, I want you to understand clearly that this assumption is almost always incorrect. The very qualities that make an empath such a valuable, rare presence in your life, their depth of perception, their genuine investment, their capacity for real, unguarded connection, are precisely the qualities that make betraying that investment carry such significant, often permanent cost. You cannot access the specific depth and quality of connection an empath offers while simultaneously assuming that connection comes without genuine risk or genuine consequence if you choose to treat it carelessly. I want to talk now about something important regarding what genuine repair, on the rare occasions it's actually possible, would actually require, because this deserves honest examination rather than simply concluding that all harm caused to an empath is permanently, irreversibly damaging regardless of subsequent effort. Genuine repair, when it's possible at all, requires far more than the typical apology or promise of change that might suffice in relationships involving less depth of investment and less significant harm. It requires sustained, demonstrated behavioral change over an extended period, genuine accountability that doesn't require the empath to do the emotional labor of managing your discomfort about having caused harm, and a fundamental willingness to accept that even successful repair likely won't fully restore the specific quality and depth of trust that existed before the original harm occurred. Some relationships, even with significant genuine effort, simply cannot fully recover the specific texture of trust and openness that preceded a significant betrayal, and accepting this reality, rather than expecting complete restoration to previous levels, represents a more honest, more sustainable foundation for whatever relationship might continue to exist going forward. I want to say something directly now to any empath listening who recognizes their own experience in everything we've discussed today, who's currently processing the specific, complicated aftermath of being genuinely hurt by someone they trusted deeply. What you're experiencing, however overwhelming, however different from how other people around you might seem to process similar disappointments, isn't excessive or disproportionate. It's an accurate reflection of the genuine depth you invested. And depth of investment naturally correlates with depth of impact when that investment is betrayed. You're not being dramatic. You're not failing to move on quickly enough by some arbitrary external timeline. You're processing something genuinely significant at exactly the pace your specific psychological makeup requires, and that pace deserves respect rather than pressure to match some faster, more superficial standard that was never actually designed with your particular depth of experience in mind. So picture this, the way we often close these conversations, not a dramatic confrontation or a triumphant moment of vindication, but something quieter, something that reflects how this kind of processing actually tends to resolve over time when it does eventually resolve. Picture yourself months or years past this specific harm, having moved through the full sequence we've discussed today, the pattern recognition, the self-doubt eventually resolved into accurate understanding rather than false self-blame, the physical symptoms gradually settling as your nervous system completes its processing, your capacity for connection eventually restored, wiser and more discerning but not permanently closed off from the genuine intimacy you remain fully capable of offering someone who actually deserves it. And picture somewhere else, the person who caused this harm, carrying forward whatever quiet, persistent awareness of loss we discussed, a consequence that unfolds regardless of whether you ever witness it directly, regardless of whether they ever fully acknowledge it even to themselves. Because that is the real, quiet, cinematic truth beneath everything we've explored today. The terrifying reality of hurting an empath was never actually about dramatic, immediate consequences designed to punish or intimidate anyone into better behavior. It's simply the natural, inevitable outcome of betraying someone whose depth of investment was always going to produce a correspondingly significant response once that investment was genuinely violated. You cannot access the extraordinary gift of an empath's genuine attention and care while assuming that gift comes free of genuine risk if you choose to treat it carelessly. And understanding this reality, whether you're the one who was hurt or the one considering whether this kind of harm is actually worth risking, changes something important about how seriously this specific kind of connection and this specific kind of betrayal genuinely deserves to be taken.